Good evening. Welcome to SCI-Arc. I am David Rue. I'm Chair of Postgraduate Studies here. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to Gilles Retsin. Gilles Retsin has his practice in London. He is Program Director of B-Pro Architectural Design at the Bartlett. He is a practicing architect as well. That's the official part. Gilles is part of I guess the Star Trek Next Generation. So if people like me and Hernan and Tom Wiscombe, some of the other people here were kind of Spock and Captain Kirk, et cetera, you're Picard and so on, right? So I think a number of things have changed since the initial adoption of computation and the digital as a discourse of architecture. I think back when I was trying to establish myself, I think there was a lot of hope for the future. How machines and technologies and new ways of thinking could somehow liberate the formal ambitions we had. I think maybe now we're living through a time when we're maybe a little bit more sober about this, and it's not entirely utopian or a happy story. I just wanted to start with this picture because, architecture since inception has struggled with the problem of putting together discrete elements to produce an illusion of continuity, and it spans millennia to our most recent century, and I think we deal with this kind of problem all the time as architects. We have to lay the bricks and these generic elements and ultimately produce some illusion, perhaps, of the continuous. But this dichotomy of what's continuous and what's discrete, I think, continues to trouble us. And I think this is one of the two things that maybe I just want to put on the table here as by way of introduction to Gilles. I think there are two issues here looking at Gilles' work that I find relevant for us to pay attention to. One is then with the current generation of architects that are taking a hardcore stab at the problem of computation itself, the recognition that computation is a discrete method, and maybe we should abandon this illusion of continuity. So I just pulled this from your website, Gilles, and it's, if anything, a kind of a strong image of, and maybe an aesthetics of the discrete. And I think one thing that I consider when I look at your work, Gilles, is what might be lost in the abandonment of the aesthetics of the continuous, and what might be gained. And are we seeing a new aesthetic category or an old one, I wonder. So that's one, the question of the discrete. The second, I think, maybe is the question of automation. I think in our embrace of machines that could liberate our formal desires within the discipline, I think machines and technologies have been looked to as the engine of that. And what's not to like about technological progress, I guess. But here's maybe just a counterpoint that I just want to also put on this table with regards to automation. Earlier this year, I was struck by this op-ed by Thomas Edsel, who's writing some incredible op-eds for the New York Times with this amazing title, "Robots Can't Vote, but They Helped Elect Trump." So Later in the article, he cites this map that was produced by some research at MIT that basically just did a kind of head count of where the robots are, and makes the observation that there's something that this tells us about why some of the red states flipped, or the blue states flipped to red. And a lot of people essentially got put out of work. So automation is something that I never anticipated in the 90s would have a kind of unanticipated economic effect of substituting labor. And I think maybe in this kind of second wave of consideration of our digital technologies and what it means for design, we can't really ignore some of these consequences. So with that light note, I'd like to welcome Gilles.
Great. Thank you, David, for the introduction. Thanks to the SCI-Arc community for getting me over here. I think actually it was a really good introduction because it actually covers a lot of the topics that are in my talk, which ranges really from kind of historical concerns with part-to-whole relationships to automation to questions of politics. So it's actually that kind of dark end note I think is quite important. So as a kind of disclaimer, so my talk is, as usual, pretty unprepared. I always try to do another talk, which is a really bad idea. But I've brought kind of 3 objects with me, or 3 devices with me from London to kind of help me do the talk. So I brought a box, I brought Greg Lynn's curve, I brought Maison Domino as well. And so with this kind of 3 devices, I kind of try to talk about that notion of the discrete. Oh, and I also brought Malevich's black square as well. So let's start with the box. So the box, I think, is kind of, perhaps at its most kind of radical in this image. This is an image by Andreas Gursky. And that's an image that really, for me, kind of defines what the digital is today. So the digital is not about kind of funky, glossy kind of Star Trek forms that are removed from this world, but it's completely embedded in the world. It's made of cardboard in a way. It's made of banal objects that we order on Amazon. And the interesting thing of this, in this image, which is basically full of kind of cardboard boxes, is the logic with which these boxes are organized. So these boxes are organized with an inhuman logic. They're basically organized with very precise algorithmic concerns of which shampoo we order most, or which book is most likely to be ordered, etc. So none of these elements, which apparently look, on first view, would look very banal and very normal, very everyday, they actually have a kind of an algorithmic logic behind them. And it's interesting to kind of look at images like this Amazon warehouses, and really propose that these images are actually digital production. So digital production is, even aesthetically, I think, far removed from what architects traditionally have thought that it was. Like this kind of almost modernist, clean, white space is actually a space of digital production. So when we involve Greg Lynn's curve in that story, of course, Greg Lynn's curve was trying to rid architecture of its parts. It was actually a proposal of an architecture that is only whole, that is always whole, that it starts out as a whole and just kind of changes and morphs into another whole. And it was a rejection of the modernist notion of basically discrete parts or elements that are assembled and then create that illusion of continuity, as was mentioned before. Like it was meant to not be an illusion. It was meant to basically be an architecture without parts. But of course, and I will actually steal that word illusion. I think that's quite interesting, that what David suggested. Of course, like the moment that you then want to create continuous work following Greg Lynn's curve, you inevitably end up with a surface, and you end up kind of with a notion that digital fabrication, robots, automation, that they are there to kind of help you establish that overall form. So while there are no parts involved in the design process, at the very last minute before it comes into the world, you basically make use of robots to derive all the parts. So all of these parts have no role in the design process. They are not on the same kind of level of importance. They're merely there as a kind of a domestication of the whole. And that paradigm went under the kind of denominator of mass customization. So the idea in the 90s was essentially that with digital technologies, you would be able to customize everything. In reality, that has been kind of mainly, and for a very weird reason, only been reduced to shoes. Like actually, the only kind of product that really follows the kind of digital ideas of the 90s, including like biological references, are shoes, right? So parametricism has its kind of like future in the shoes. So if you Google digital architecture today, or like digital plus architecture, not digital architecture, but these kind of two words, you really get kind of brought to that, what I would say kind of tacky paradigm of the Nike shoe, right? So you see these kind of objects which have vague kind of references to nature, to biological systems, etc., and they're all kind of based on that notion of mass customization, on that notion of basically, form that can be created by domesticating its parts. So when I started my practice and after graduating, I really wanted to take a big distance from this world. Although I do have to say, like, I always show these images to debate, to kind of provoke. But then I recently discovered two of those images are from my office. This one and this one. So I need to recycle those. So essentially, like if you look today at that concern of mass customization, the image on the left has been used a lot by architects in the past to basically describe the relationship between production and an architectural language. So that's the Ford factory, where you see serialized production, and then the architecture kind of responds to that as well with a kind of universal serialized production. But while this image was used to really dismiss, in a way, a kind of that paradigm of seriality and of discreteness and mass production, in a way, what we see today, that actually the paradigm of mass customization actually looks like this space. And the very least that you can say is that the contemporary spaces of digital production and the old image of serial production, that they at least have a kind of an ambiguous relationship. They're not this kind of hyperbolic future as the Nike shoe tries to tell us that it is, but it's actually much more, much closer related to that old system of production. And the thing that is different in that image is not actually the form, but it's actually the system of organization between parts that is different. And that's also something like, this is just as a kind of a provocation, but it's also something that you really see in digital objects. So digital objects today, the most prolific ones are not mass customized. I think probably 60% of the audience has the same black iPhone in their pocket. You can choose any color you want as long as it's black. So what kind of, so if you kind of look at those spaces, you could suggest, and that's something that the discrete proposes, that actually the digital is not primarily something that has a kind of a formal repercussion, but it's actually a system that has deep political and social repercussions to it. One of which was mentioned in the introduction, the kind of political consequences, basically, of automating labor. So I edited a volume of architectural design called The Discrete, which will come out in April next year. That brings together basically a new generation of people that tries to understand the digital, not from this kind of paradigm of continuity and mass customization, and not as something that is primarily about form, but basically looking at the digital as a system that has political and social consequences, and that kind of starts from the notion that by reintroducing the part, that we could actually start to capitalize on certain political possibilities of the digital. And I think in a way I'm just kind of very briefly going over these images from the introduction, which kind of show a certain kind of, a certain everyday, non-hyperbolic, but very committed project of the digital. And did this talk, I mean, I won't actually talk too much about the kind of the overall paradigm of the discrete in this talk, but I will mainly talk about my own work as an architect. I will probably do another lecture at some point about, the discrete as a kind of a project, a kind of a shared project. So, in a way, so you get this kind of, between the modernist notion of assembly, the discrete is kind of a weird kind of parallel in a way, kind of a symmetry to that notion, where parts, where basically you get universal generic parts back in the game. So the other device, so this was kind of roughly basically talking a bit about discreteness, talking a bit about Greg Lynn's curve as a device. So the next two devices that we'll briefly use are the box and the domino. So the box is a kind of, it's a theoretical device that I developed, which is basically inspired by some of Slavoj Žižek's statements that sometimes you need to oversimplify things to find the kind of the core, like he's saying we think too much in shades of gray and we should be kind of more black and white. So this box basically helps as a device to oversimplify architectural history. And I'm sorry for the people who teach architectural history here in SCI-Arc, like the next slides are really blunt and very untrue, but I think but also very productive. So the meta box basically consists of points, a mass, lines, and surfaces. And what it allows you to do is kind of oversimplify architectural history. So in this little diagram, you see kind of what, like architectural history, like what we have done until now. So you could roughly argue that everything was based on mass until basically early modernism, where instead of operating on the level of the meta box itself, on the level of the mass, you basically start to operate on the level of planes and lines. And essentially then the kind of the parametric project is a liquid version of that surface project, which we just discussed. So then if you're a young architect and if you graduate and you want to do something new, the only kind of parts that are left in the box to play with in the meta box are essentially the points, right? So we can kind of do a project based on the most discrete parts of those boxes, whereas the other parts in the box have kind of been used. This is the tacky version of the same diagram. So you can kind of see, like, you know, the project of basically Poche, mass, etc., the project of lines, and then the liquidification of that project, and then the kind of the project in a way of points or data, the project of discreteness. And we can do the same kind of really blunt kind of architectural history course with the domino. So this is also like architectural history until modernism, right? So so everything is essentially based on mass, right? On compression walls. And then you have this kind of really interesting moment where essentially architecture flips inside out. Like that's the kind of the most radical moment that ever happened to architecture, when the domino enters the field. So when the domino comes, architecture completely changes. Like it literally flips inside out. There's all of a sudden no more notion of a facade. There's no more notion of walls, essentially, and it completely changes, right? And so the domino is a kind of, it's a very persistent model. Like it's really difficult to get rid of it. Philippe Morel calls it the universal Turing machine of architecture. Everything you try to do kind of comes back to this model and you know, hits you back in the face, and we're kind of still struggling a lot with trying to deal with that extremely successful model. And I think it's also really interesting as an architectural model because it kind of, it's really on the line between being genius and stupid, which is, I think, something that architecture, you know, always situates itself at. Like this model is so, in one way, so stupid that Le Corbusier, even when he developed it, didn't actually recognize that this was a genius model. It took him roughly 20 years to understand that this was actually the most radical thing that he had done, right? And it's also kind of, you know, it's important to recognize this kind of persistence of that model. And I'll just skip this. So basically, like that model in the next version of, like, in the next decade of blunt architectural history diagrams, that model keeps persisting. It keeps kind of being in the background of architectural moves, right? Like it's in terms of part-to-whole relationships, it's always kind of operating behind how things look like. And even today, like today, this basically comes back, but in colored versions. Like this is this was basically, you know, postmodernism, deconstructivism, the parametric project, kind of object project, and then today, like you get these rehashes with a kind of a color scheme. Of those projects, right? But essentially, like under the skin of all of those things, you still have this kind of universal Turing machine of architecture, that kind of Maison Domino that supports all of those all of those moves, right? And if you then look at architecture, you kind of realize that in a way the domino is there, and then it's essentially kind of fitted out with a certain meaning. Like in the parametric computational project, it's fitted out with a kind of a computational meaning, like it's actually kind of communicating to you that, that they're digital, that a computer has been used in the design process of fitting out this domino. In a kind of object project, it communicates that it's an object. So when I graduated from the AA and started my practice, this was one of the first projects I did together with Isaïe Bloch. And it was a kind of a project where we decided to do everything that was not allowed to do at the AA, that we were not supposed to do, which was doing an object, making something that has a material quality, etc. And what I realized when doing this project is that actually the thing that interested me most was not was not actually the object itself, but what interested me most was kind of the wild organization of parts like this kind of zooming in almost on the objects. Like it was actually the organization of parts rather than the kind of the overall form or the figure that was of interest to me. And this then kind of continued in a series of projects which were always still defined by an object or by kind of an overall figure, but always a kind of the moment that for me is interesting is the organization of this part. So I started kind of questioning really through those projects if actually the overall figure or the form for me was relevant at all, right? If actually my project should be concerned with that. So so I started to work kind of with more and more generic containers in a way to allow this organization of parts to take place. And in many ways, I would like to kind of also argue that that effort of kind of ridding itself of the kind of the figure or the form is also in a way a kind of a mode of resistance to kind of an extremely image-driven culture that happened after the end of modernism, which in this book by René de Graaf is described. And it's really a project that kind of wants to resist basically the reduction of architecture to a surface. And I think that's almost like a political project. So you could argue that architecture today happens kind of in this like 1 centimeter space between the suspended ceiling and the next suspended ceiling below it, right? So basically this entire world is kind of extra architectural, and we are kind of reduced basically to that kind of just merely the kind of surface that then communicates whether you're interested in computation or in history or in other notions, right? So the entire kind of interest of architecture is actually situated today outside of architecture. Right? We are just reduced to this mere line. So my kind of project was really interested in a way kind of rebelling or revolting against that kind of reduction to the surface and kind of trying to see if we could, colonize or occupy basically the volume, right? If we could extend architecture again to this kind of space. And why is that important? Like you could say for me it's important as a designer, but it also has big consequences for our profession and for a kind of potential political impact. And this is like pretty dry, but like these are just some diagrams from The Economist, which basically shows the productivity of construction versus other industries. And a large part of the reason why architects are, why the profession of architecture is kind of in some way in a crisis with being very low paid, being reduced to that surface, is partially because we're not able to kind of get this productivity up, right? And that's another funny diagram. This basically shows the digitization, like the level of digitization in the construction industry. So we are right here just above hunting. So hunting is actually the least digitized profession because it's not fun to hunt with drones and, it's an artisanal sport, right? Agriculture is actually globally below construction, but actually if you look at the Western world, it's actually right here on top, right? So it's actually just between kind of construction and hunting, like who's more primitive. And that, of course, results that has major complications, like the fact that we are not dealing with automation and digitization, has major consequences for things like a housing crisis, accessibility to housing, etc. And it's important, like my kind of statement is basically that part of the reason, like we cannot really automate or digitize architecture if we are reduced to this surface. Like we actually need to kind of, in a way, colonize back that volume in order to access those questions. And it's also important to realize, like until now, kind of the only thing architects have kind of come up with in terms of digitization and automation is what I would say kind of really restricted to hipster ideas, like the Fab Lab. Like you can see the hipster here with the beard and the glasses. And it's kind of the idea that, you know, purely through things like a Fab Lab that you could actually increase access to housing, which is, I think, a very kind of naive idea, right? So, so this is really like where this notion of automation comes in. Like the question, like, could we actually start to shift thinking from mere like digital design to actually starting to think about automation? And I actually also think that's a kind of both a notion of being digital and a notion of being post-digital, like the realization that if automation is all around us and if it's part of the everyday, that actually we could just take that on board and try to think about it. And I actually think that automation is really a design project. So it's not a project of robots, it's actually a project of architects trying to figure out how we could automate. So in a way, like this part of the lecture is kind of a long-winded kind of disclaimer a little bit about a kind of foundation that I operate on as a designer, right? And it comes also a little bit from my kind of schizophrenic background between coming from having worked in Switzerland before I went to the AA with Christian Keretz, where essentially we were operating on the kind of the fundamental aspects of this domino rather than on the surface, right? So in a way, my architecture kind of comes from this kind of background of both being interested in computation, but then also being interested in this kind of disciplinary kind of hardcore of architecture. So the problem then is if you want to actually design an architecture without whole, right? So an architecture without a figure, an architecture that only consists of parts, how can we actually keep authorship in that? Like how can we prevent a kind of World of Warcraft architecture, but actually kind of author and develop design methodologies in this kind of ultra discrete world? Like how can you design without drawing, right? And previously in the kind of digital design world, that question had been answered with what I call the kind of shopping mall of algorithms. Like these are all kind of cliche algorithms that have been used by architects to organize basically lots of discrete parts into buildings, right? So that is kind of projected onto architecture rather than those rules kind of coming really from architecture. So we have like Voronoi diagrams, swarms, cellular automata, etc. But the question for me is really like, could we actually develop those kind of rules of how we organize parts without that kind of indexical relationship to a natural algorithm? And initially, this is my graduation project from the AA. Initially, that kind of really works still in that kind of natural algorithm world, right? And I think also, like, if you actually, although there are lots of interesting aspects of this, basically that it also operates as a volume, but essentially you could also still read the kind of a figure in there. Like you can, on the one hand, you need an algorithm to organize all of those materials, but in the end you can still look at it and kind of look at it as a kind of a figural project. So the same with this work, which is the Guggenheim Museum in Helsinki. Like that project is kind of working towards essentially looking at an increased notion of parts, but at the same time it's still easy to kind of draw or sketch that project. Like you still read that project basically as a kind of volume and a big horizontal slab, but it's still the parts are still kind of domesticated to construct that whole. And looking back at that project, actually the part that I think that was actually most successful for me was the least figural part, is actually this floor slab here. So when I finished that project, the floor slab rather than the kind of the extravagant roof structure became a kind of a driver for for the next work. And on the one hand, like when you're inside of this building, like this is the big exhibition hall, you kind of, there's kind of a moment that the figure or the hall disappears and you're purely in a kind of a world that is defined by an organization of parts, which is, you know, you kind of get rid more of the figure when you're in the interior of that building. Which brings us to the next object that I took from London, which is the Black Square from Malevich. And this is really kind of, for me, very interesting to talk about, you know, the question of figure, hall, and parts, and in a way also access the notion of abstraction. So when you look at this painting, the question is like, how did Malevich actually draw this, paint this painting? Like, did he, you know, he established he wanted a black square, but did he actually start to, you know, to paint, to follow the brush strokes kind of along the edges to construct his abstraction? Or did he actually go diagonally through this painting, which then gives you a really big problem when you hit the corner point? Or did he paint it kind of in a random motion, right? Or did he first draw a duck and then went over it again as a kind of, you know, as a kind of joke, you know? So it's really intriguing to kind of think basically how you can make a painting that is that abstract, right? Or did he first use masking tape and then kind of paint the whole thing, but then isn't like the masking tape then the, you know, the black square rather than the actual black square? So you could essentially do like almost an entire exhibition with black squares, right? Which could all have an entirely different ontology behind them. Like some of them could be done, you know, with all these different paradigms. And funny enough, the black square today looks like this in Tate Modern. So it actually kind of cracked into a Voronoi diagram today. So this is really interesting in terms of basically problems of you know, kind of matter parts versus the construction of this abstraction, right? And today it's actually very easy to do proper black squares, you know, that can actually deal with the abstraction. Like you could easily compute basically every pixel and not have to deal with this kind of, you know, this kind of questions. And in many ways, you could, I'm kind of interested in the question then, like if that's the, you know, you have those problems in the black square, but actually if you make the black cube, you're kind of confronted in a way with similar problems. And if you look at people who, before we had the computer, who kind of could, in a way, deal with that level of abstraction are like, in my opinion, like the abstract expressionists, like Clifford Still or Mark Rothko, who basically managed to kind of acknowledge in a way that they were painting and didn't need, they were kind of dealing with the brush stroke immediately in the painting. So my work kind of enters a little bit, like after doing the Guggenheim, entered in that domain where basically I decided that the figure is not important for me, but basically purely that organization of the parts. So you could actually, this is a competition for the Liget Museum in Budapest, which I just decided to not be bothered about the figure at all, about the outline of that building, but essentially just kind of resolve the slabs into a series of parts, where the entire quality of the building and the entire interest is on that level of how you basically construct that abstraction rather than on the overall figure. Yeah, and that's also something that kind of resonates in a way in a lot of the work we do today also as research. Like this is research into robotic 3D printing, which I do together with my colleague Manuel Jimenez, where essentially we're not really bothered by the overall figure, but merely develop algorithms that are able to kind of organize massive amount of parts into in respect to each other. Oh, I need to skip this. Sorry. Yeah. So the question is then, like, if you do that on an architectural scale, this is the chunk of the Budapest Museum, where basically that kind of gets resolved really in thousands of small linear elements that are aggregated together. And then in the practice, I started questioning more and more how radical you could actually push that form of discreteness. So you started to develop building elements like these ones, which are basically this kind of hexagonal piles or chunks that are aggregated, which then resulted in projects like this, which is a sketch for a museum in Vienna at the Karlsplatz. And it's interesting, like if you compare this project to the Guggenheim project, it actually doesn't really require the kind of the precisely defined hall anymore. Like there's more and more agency assigned to merely the aggregation of the parts. And this started to become really important in the Blokhut project. So the Blokhut project is a project by a friend of mine from Belgium that I studied together with. He became a climate engineer, which means that instead of an architect, which meant that he had a lot of money and needed an architect. And as he's, as he was someone who was good with money, the idea was to basically convince him. He went to me and said, like, Gilles, I know you will do something really crazy, but try to keep it kind of simple. So the idea was basically to go to him and say, like, look, the whole building is just based on this part. And we'll just basically assemble all of those parts together into your house. Like your house is actually completely based on kind of a rational serialization. And the only thing you really have to pay extra for it is red zones, which are the zones where those parts are customized and intersect. So these red zones, although they do have a kind of a repeating pattern through them. So that's a kind of the model for that building, which is in a very kind of strange moment because it's really kind of walking, I think, an interesting line between being organic and assembled and between familiar and weird. So to convince him that it was possible to build this, we made this big architectural model made of lots of plaster pieces that are assembled. And essentially the model is kind of, it's essentially a very stupid model if you try to do something like this as an architect, because essentially you're building a horizontal brick wall, right? So the only way how this could work was actually by adding a layer in tension on top of it, which is this glass fiber layer here that keeps the horizontal brick wall into place. But anyway, like we managed to kind of construct that model and compare it basically to the rendering, and then kind of show him that it's possible to do this. So that's the kind of the final image in the forest, and and essentially like this building kind of really started to introduce that idea of driving that discreteness to a more and more radical moment where you really just have like one part that starts to construct a whole. That project obviously didn't happen. Like although all of these nice arguments, he didn't buy the project. So then I recycled exactly the same building system for another version of this museum again in Vienna at the Karlsplatz. And it's interesting then to like look at this building, and basically the argument here is that although it consists of things that look like slabs, that essentially this building has actually no slab, and it also has no column. It essentially just exists of an agglomeration or an assembly of parts. That also didn't happen, of course. So in the end, that just exists as kind of a piece of furniture. So if you bring back Greg Lynn's curve and kind of try to understand basically what is kind of, how far you could actually push a system that consists just of one element. The interesting thing is that those parts are always kind of immediately also organized in a volumetric way. So for the next project is essentially zooming in almost on one of the competition projects in Vienna, and kind of scaling up those parts and really understanding how they would be constructed. So they're essentially made of timber sheets that are assembled into this L-shaped building blocks. So this is a multi-family home, which means like there's basically 3 families living there. And again, the kind of argument is that this is a building that is, to a certain degree, has a kind of excessive language, but essentially consists of always the same parts that are assembled together. So you have this kind of really large parts, this hierarchy, then you have smaller parts, etc., that are assembled together. And well, what is interesting for me here is that that it's really kind of establishing an architecture that is radical in terms of its qualities. So you cannot look at this building and say that this is a column. This is actually, I would argue, ontologically 2 or 3 parts that together perform the function of a column. So function is not embedded anymore in an architectural element, but function becomes an emergent property of the assembly itself. And the other strange thing is that essentially in this kind of spaces, you get a kind of an experience almost of phenomenologically of total continuity. So although this is made out of discrete elements, you're almost in a kind of a cave-like organic environment where there is one material that constructs everything that surrounds you. While at the same time, you can always at every point distinguish the building block and the part itself. And like also when looking at this kind of architecture, the idea is basically that this is a building that resists a super hull or a super form. There is no kind of predefined overarching form, but there is essentially a form that is continuously unfinished, and where the parts are on the same ontological level of importance as their kind of overall final state. So you cannot kind of describe this building through a diagram or a superform. You can also not understand it through an assembly of slabs or columns. You can really just kind of understand this as a series of parts that continuously remain a part and that never at any point are kind of domesticated to be a whole, right? And so that's also kind of a Belgian move. The Belgians are good at surrealism, to say like that basically that this is not a column and that this is not a slab, but these are basically always kind of ontologically speaking remain kind of assemblies of parts. And of course that's a very difficult debate to have. I always get attacked on making that statement. Like lots of people say, like, come on, this is just like 3 slabs and this is a column, right? And that's also funny that this was actually in the introduction by David, that of course this is a kind of a problem that architecture has struggled with for a long time. And in many ways, of course, these Greek columns are also made of discrete, elements of stone that have been assembled. But it's important that I think kind of ontologically speaking, that on that level, the stone itself has no importance. It's actually just merely there to kind of establish this column. While in this case of these columns, we're resisting every part remains actually a part. And remains also kind of a readable part, which is expressed by over-exaggerating the joints and the shadow gaps between the elements. And again, also important to kind of point out in terms of functionality that this part and this part is exactly the same. There's no more material in this building element than there is in this building element. So some of the parts perform a kind of a heroic function, like here they're actually carrying a lot of load, and some of the other parts perform a kind of a silly function by just being merely, decorative or kind of forming a seating surface. Yeah, and it's interesting to kind of question at what moment basically a part gains ontologically that kind of independence of the whole. For example, here in the Baalbek megalith, that's a human here, and this is a building block. So at this moment, purely through kind of the scale of things, you could argue that the Baalbek megalith, in a way, is a building where maybe the parts ontologically are on the same level of importance as the whole, just merely because of their incredible dimensions. And that's also kind of worth maybe noting to kind of pitch in some of discussions that are also going on in the school here. Like that's really kind of this notion that Levi Bryant called strange Mariology, right? It's a moment that basically objects are ontologically on the same level of importance as famous flat ontology. And I would kind of argue that to a certain extent, this body of work is kind of influenced by that idea of of creating a strange mereology, a moment where none of the parts are dependent on the whole, but they kind of operate on the same level of importance. It's also interesting in terms of domesticity. Like in many ways, I would argue this is a kind of a very maybe millennial building. So what you see, like this floor plan is not accidentally kind of drawn like this. You see, it's a floor plan with a kind of a loose arrangement of furniture, and it's really kind of meant that in this building that you basically the kind of the discrete parts operate to a certain extent. They create this kind of almost cave-like structure, but then everything else that basically caters for human needs is not part of the system. This is something else that I get criticized for a lot. But essentially the facade, I'm completely uninterested in facades. So the facade is absolutely not a part of the system. There's no attempt to do that. I think kind of the facade in a way is a kind of a completely separate project, and the only thing it's trying to do is to basically not exist, right? To just kind of offer transparency, but disappear as something that is a big architectural concern. So all of the kind of the human domestic activities are taking place outside of the system, which is this kind of also reference in a way to another project by Super Studio as a kind of a precedent. So also things like the lighting, for example, there is actually no lighting embedded in the building itself. It's all kind of just added, and I deliberately just show the wire. Like it's really the idea that you almost go to a cave and you kind of try to make it inhabitable. The same with the speakers here, just kind of almost temporarily kind of positioned in that building. Also the stairs and doors, in this case the stair is even not located in the building, but is located outside of the perimeter wall, and then you have a kind of a little bridge into the building. So, and that's actually something that carries through all the projects, so everything that caters to the human is separate, like also in this case, the staircases are not part of the system, or in this case as well. And that's something that also, I think architecturally there's a lineage of doing this. It's not, for example, here in this building by a Belgian architect, Julian Lampens, you also see that essentially the architectural part is just the concern with these big concrete walls. And then to make it inhabitable, there's basically a series of objects added to it. So then the kind of statement is then in a way that, and that's, the term smooth here refers to Deleuze and Guattari when they use, when they talk about the smooth and the striated, which continuously operate together. And the same in architecture, essentially the discrete and the continuous are always in a dialogue together. So, and in many ways, like that's kind of an interesting comparison to say that in the end, kind of what these discrete pieces establish is a kind of an ultimate continuity. So in many ways, there's a kind of a very interesting edge basically to what you can consider continuous and what you can consider discrete. So I would argue that all of these domino diagrams that I'm drawing here establish an architecture that is actually phenomenologically, but also ontologically speaking, continuous in the end, which is an interesting debate. Now there are also some concerns that basically come from some basically benefits that happen from this move, this radical reduction from architecture as this kind of complicated assembly to a kind of an assembly that is oversimplified and almost stupid, right? Like that's probably, I think, the most interesting move of the discrete is the consequences of reducing architecture from, on average, an assembly of 7,000 parts and processes to essentially just a few parts. And that's a very important notion for automation. Like that's actually why I'm saying also that automation is a design project. Because essentially, if we want to automate this kind of syntax that is based on the 7,000 different parts, we have a little bit of trouble if you want to automate that with a robot. And this is essentially what architects have been trying to do for the past 20 years. So their vision of thinking about robots has essentially been not to change the architecture, but essentially, have an orange robotic arm attack one of those 7,000 parts. And that's, of course, it's a weird kind of effort. Like these are 5 Korean PhD students who have been automating a robot to put floor tiles for 5 years. So if you make the calculation how long it would take to automate architecture at large, so that takes 5 Korean PhD students times 5 years times 7,000 parts, right? So of course it's a kind of a futile exercise to try to automate a system that is completely based on manual labor. So it's actually a design project to try to rethink not the robot itself, but essentially try to rethink the syntax of architecture. And essentially when I got hired at the Bartlett, the question was, they had bought a few of those orange robotic arms. And the question was basically like, you are young, you need to do something with these robots. We don't really know what to do with it. And our kind of initial idea was really to question basically the use of those robots. And all of the robots kind of worldwide, all of these orange machines essentially operate on a kind of a paradigm of craft or mass customization. So they never thought of as means to really automate something, but they're more meant as a kind of aesthetic exercise of craft, right? So in a way, what kind of the discrete body of work is trying to suggest is instead of looking at robots as this kind of world of digital design and doing cute and beautiful things, essentially kind of look at it like how it operates in the world of automation. This is the Ocado warehouse, which is a fully automated warehouse in the UK where you basically order vegetables, tomatoes, shampoo, everything you want, and this kind of little robots pick it up in this massive super studio-like grid and then deliver it it gets delivered at your doorstep. And the light is only switched on here to make the picture. In fact, you don't even need, there are no humans in this factory. And that's essentially a little bit the idea of like, instead of looking at mass production as this kind of beautiful world, could we actually also look at it, at this kind of inhuman world of automation as something that could give something back to architecture and become a creative project. Which is, what this kind of weird explorations by students at the Bartlett are trying to do. Yeah, I'll just maybe quickly show. I'm running a bit out of time, so I'll just skip this. Yeah. So the question, and also in my practice, is essentially also a question of scale, which is a question like how large can these parts actually get, right? Like before it becomes another project. So this project for a museum in Korea is essentially exploring parts that are extremely large. That's a human here, human scale figures. So these are kind of 15 to 20 meters long CLT lumber elements that are assembled. And then you get something strange that basically, ontologically speaking, again, this kind of they're almost like on a megalithical scale, right? It's the kind of these huge parts which are incredibly present in the building and also start to balance a kind of a weird relation between what is figural and what is not figural, because they are so large, they're actually kind of almost micro figures that are assembled together. So this whole museum consists of 273 parts. They're actually exactly these parts. So if you take those parts, you assemble them into this series of exhibition pavilions. And it's also interesting here that you essentially get a language that is not so dependent anymore on the number. It's much more realistic in terms of building technology, while maintaining the kind of the core idea of that discrete project. And here we also integrated all the technical devices into this into the elements. And from some perspectives, you get a kind of almost a highly reduced kind of visual language, while conceptually speaking, it's still the same project. There's this German architect who has theorized that work, and he has kind of advanced the notion that architecture is actually that it is a complete distraction to basically think about part-to-whole relationships in this way, and that it would make much more, that architecture is essentially kind of a phenomenological project where you should always think about it as a kind of a layering of surfaces that is meant to communicate something, right? Which was argued most on top of basically this project, that if you would actually construct this, the effort of making this out of discrete pieces was a futile effort. Anyway, so and I would actually argue exactly the opposite, right? I would actually argue that, like, if you look at Villa Savoie before it was restored, I found it deeply shocking that this was not made of concrete. It was actually made of cement block, right? Or like this image is basically, right? Like, my kind of argument, different to Colin Rowe's argument, why the modernists were never modern, would be more on kind of the level of these images than on the kind of the level of composition. So if you look at the section of this museum in Korea, you kind of see the insane, in a way, kind of stupidity or simplicity of those parts coming together with his massive joints. And again, it's also kind of important to point out in these drawings that, of course, there is this weird snake line here, which completely escapes the logic of the building. The only reason why that snake line is there is really just because I like it. Like, there's no, there is no kind of deep political argument behind this thing, but it's really, in a way, kind of something that felt good for the design, in contrast to that. To this kind of organization of parts, right? Anyway, so I got a chance to test out these ideas in this project for the Tallinn Biennale, where I won the competition. And I won the competition, so the competition actually asked to do a parametric pavilion. So they wanted this kind of material optimization game with timber. And I actually reversed the brief and actually asked I actually proposed to do a high-rise block, like to be interested in kind of mass housing, and essentially started out designing a mass housing block, and then just isolated, just took one part of this mass housing block and used that as the pavilion. So the pavilion is completely based on sheets of plywood. That's just one sheet of plywood, which you cut with the CNC machine into a kit of parts, and then this kit of parts establishes this building block. These building blocks are then stitched together under tension and produce something that acts as a continuous beam, structurally speaking. And in terms of like detailing, and that's actually very important for this project. In terms of detailing, the idea was to deal with these blocks as an absolute abstraction, so none of the kind of CNC cut details, the DIY details, should be visible. So all of the kind of the mechanics and the kind of engineering of constructing these monolithical blocks are essentially hidden and are not visible in the final product. The only thing we spend a lot of time on is actually, again, creating this really big shadow gap so that you would understand that so that you would always be able to kind of read and see these pieces as independent entities. And creating that shadow gap was actually like a big problem in terms of also, like, if you cut plywood, there's a lot of moist that goes through those shadow gaps, and it's kind of difficult for the plywood. The idea was that we could also automate the assembly of those blocks itself. So you would actually use a robot to kind of just automate those blocks when you assemble it. These are the blocks waiting for assembly, which are this kind of like, I mean, they're not huge, but they kind of, they do have a scale that you kind of rarely encounter in architecture. So they're 2 meters 30. They're kind of mini megaliths in one way. This is when we're shipping it to the site. And then you see this kind of, I think, quite beautiful moments of assembly. That's Oscar, one of the people that helped with the assembly. And you kind of see this incredible, the kind of the size of that building block versus the human body. And here you can see before we finished off the detailing, like you see here, the metal rods that basically stitch those blocks together before they're covered. And I mean, this is Kevin, one of the other people that worked for me, which was able to kind of just grab one of those blocks and build, right, with these elements in a kind of very primitive and simple way. I couldn't do that. I'm not strong enough to do that, but he could. Yeah. And as you can see, also the building is it basically has this parts that are covered in black tar where there's more moist. So basically the top establishes kind of black strata and then the bottom. And again, important to point out kind of the game of the shadow gaps between those parts. Also the fact that it's raised off the ground. It's kind of, it was quite interesting, like for me, this pavilion was a kind of a playground really, like this is kind of the crazy corner where the building is kind of really in this kind of perpetual state of being unfinished and absolutely kind of non-figural. Then there are other parts that are really rectilinear, like this is kind of, in a way, an experiment to see if this kind of work would actually be able to sustain itself without, any kind of purely perpendicular orthogonal way. With then again a kind of the crazy corner from the back. And the kind of what was also interesting is that the realization for me when the pavilion was when this installation was finished is that actually the parts could have been bigger. So there was actually one of they're already big, but essentially when you're there the same structure would actually also sustain itself if the parts would be double or triple the size. Just skip this. So this pavilion is still up for the moment in the snow, and it's also important to mention. So now I'm curating the next iteration of this pavilion, which will see a lot of people that also maybe you are familiar with. Competing with each other, like kind of the competition of the generation. So that will be interesting to follow. And it's interesting, I mean, for me, I always say, like, I have this kind of Freudian slip to call it a pavilion, but for me it was not a pavilion. It was really, in a way, a piece to speculate about mass housing. It's kind of, for me, a kind to, I mean, it's a little bit pretentious to say, but it wanted to kind of be a kind of a fragment or kind of domino, kind of a prototype for a larger system of housing rather than a pavilion that is merely concerned with itself. And housing is something that I have been kind of secretly working on for the last 2-3 years, which has kind of translated, for example, in this project, which is a 200-meter long housing block that consists all of this kind of black L-shaped parts. And the idea is basically that by positioning those building blocks, you have the possibility to differentiate living spaces in the core and not at the surface. So there's this kind of large project of different, of a kind of concern with basically domestic spaces that I'm running in the background. So to wrap it up, really, the question then is like, how low can you go with this resolution? Like, at what moment is this kind of Greg Lynn curve story running out of steam? And it's of course interesting that actually, like, you don't actually change the argument, you don't actually change the algorithm, but you get this kind of 0 point where Greg Lynn's curve is completely reduced, right? And so the kind of the last body of work that I'm doing is very interested in this kind of exploring basically this kind of 0 degree of architecture, right? Like the moment that we're really close to basically operate with barely anything. And I think it's actually interesting that I think there is again a kind of a moment in time that level of abstraction is interesting. Like, I think some of this kind of abstract art moves are becoming really popular, like for example with Off-White, or with projects like Chaos or DXX. So essentially there's a kind of a body of work boiling up for the past year, which is based on this ultra low resolution, extremely large parts. And got a chance to test one of those on a concert hall in Germany, where we basically, this is an existing concert hall, it's in Nuremberg. And that's a project together with Stefan Albrecht, a German architect. And essentially they were asking for an extension of the building. So essentially just proposed, as a way to trick the jury, we just proposed a big box. It's in Germany, so that works. Because like with these competitions, you need to qualify. So our idea was we will just send them a box, and then when they get into the second round, they will discover that this box is not actually a box, right? So that worked. So we got into the second round of a competition for a concert hall against a few big offices. And then we started to basically define that, to scare the jury, that the box that they had chosen was much more scary than they had thought. So these are the building blocks of that box. So they're all factory cut CLT elements. And these are all the elements you need to make a functional concert hall. So we don't have any more elements than these ones. And those elements are set into a really large voxel space. These are people, that's a voxel. So these are like massive voxels. And essentially on a computational level, every one of those voxels has a little V-shaped element. And then these V-shaped elements are assembled into basically, things that move between being a column and a floor. And I then translate it into sheets. And I stole this diagram from my students. This is not a diagram for the project, but it illustrates the point quite well. So you have this kind of voxel space where you have all these building elements, which are then basically rotating and flipping and kind of assembling together into a series of columns and beams. So that's the entire concert hall laid out in the sheets after the voxels have been assembled. Again, kind of a massive scale. That's the kind of the procedure where you have all of the computationally discrete parts then turned into discrete sheets that can be all prefabricated and cut in a factory. This is kind of the sequence of assembly. So essentially, everything in this building is based on the same material and the kind of the same part throughout. So it's really kind of a completely monolithical structure. And it's also interesting to point out again about that question of like detailing, that this is really like detailing for children. Like this is kind of a kindergarten detailing that you need to construct this building. Like it's literally just these massive sheets of timber which you can throw together and assemble, and then kind of you just need to kind of quickly kind of close it off at the edge. But there is almost no detailing in this building, and it was interesting for me to kind of really explore with this building how much we were willing to reduce the kind of the level of excitement in that project as well. There's this really nice statement by Rem Koolhaas where he says that he has a high tolerance for repetition and excitement. So I would say like in this building kind of developed a similar tolerance for that. And of course, like what is actually interesting in this building is that it's a box, right? But again, like ontologically speaking, it's not a box. So it's a complete kind of, it's just an aggregation of these similar voxel-based L-shaped building parts that construct this entire building. And although this building may look like a series of slabs and columns, it's actually a building that has no columns and that has no slabs. Actually, even structurally speaking, it's just basically these elements that continuously maintain their level of being mere elements. And again, this is expressed also through this kind of extravagant joints that you see kind of reappearing in the edges of that building. Again, the staircase or anything that makes human inhabitation possible is excluded from the system. So you have this kind of continuous staircase cutting through the ceiling there. And it's also important to notice like this kind of the fact that the timber texture is absolutely fake. This was actually a mistake from the render people. Like we tried to convince them to do a good timber texture, but they didn't really manage. So, but it's actually also interesting because in a way these elements are artificial anyway. So you could actually kind of design the texture to be overscaled. And the concert hall sits in the middle, and it's just kind of a subdivision of this larger system. Yeah, so we'll keep it there. Thank you.